Thank you very much for being here. Just to start, only this part of the introduction from our side will be recorded. The other discussion will be under Chatham House rules. It's always, it's not the best time of the day to have side events because the delegations are busy with of course, with lunch and with also some other bilateral activities. Anyway, our plan was to share our views of the week with member states and other stakeholders. We will start with what we have now. I have my three colleagues starting us for the discussion. Lison from CCFDT in France, she will tell us about how she will recap the week in terms of, from our perspective, how the week was passed for in our view, and then I have my colleague from TGNA, Evelyn will summarize the major issues that we have been discussed during the week, and then Tove was Eurodad and also Global Alliance Tax Justice Coordination Committee member, who also co-coordinates the tax and DRM work stream at the CSO50 mechanism. She will, from what happens this week, what will then we'll be hoping to see in the last 3 days of the TOR discussion with at the UN. I give the floor to Lison.
Thank you, Derege. So what happened this week? I mean, in many ways, I think it was an amazing week for us organization working on tax justice. I mean, we've really come a long way. For a decade, we've been campaigning to have true international tax negotiation to solve these issues of tax avoidance, of tax injustice. And while this week we've been having this for the first time, true international tax negotiation with all countries invited. And speaking of the tax convention, even 2 years ago, tax convention was still not on the mouth of everybody. And now we have countries discussing, all countries from all around the world, different regions, discussing tax convention. And this has been very inspiring to watch and to comment on this week. On the subjects that has been discussed, especially on high-level engagement, we are very happy to see that many subjects have been on the table and will probably be part of the TOR according to the chair. Different subjects from high net worth individual taxation, when we see that many countries were pushing for this, and not only G20 countries, but countries from all around the world, which really said that the UN is the place to have this discussion. But also on tax and environment, the issue of transparency has been raised by many countries. And we particularly noticed and appreciated that many G77 countries pointed out that capacity building could not be sufficient for countries to be able to collect tax because of the flow tax system, and that addressing the international tax system and the fair division of taxing rights was a key issue to be addressed with this TOR and this convention. We've heard a lot about the issue of duplication, and for us it's very hard to understand. Many delegates have raised this very eloquently, that there are no standards that have been taken upon by every countries, and that the only space to have a universal, true standard be established is within the UN. And we really feel that we can have a good deal out of this convention that will help all countries around the world, developing countries, but also developed countries, to be able to collect tax money and to spend it to good public services, to protect the human rights of their citizens. So we have the chance here to really achieve something meaningful, something important, and the first week in that way has been very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim? Now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dereje. So as has been mentioned by Lizo, we saw quite a strong standing and quite a strong show of support and solidarity from members of the G77 as well as from the African group. I think at first, especially this week, we had a few what I would call disingenuous arguments coming from the floor, such as, you know, that domestic resource mobilization does not involve international tax cooperation, or that capacity building is one of the key things that should be pursued through the Framework Convention. But we saw member states actually come out very strongly and shoot this down. And in fact, my observation is that most of the member states, it was actually representatives from the ministries of finance and the tax administrations who've actually been implementing existing standards, who are shooting down these arguments quite quickly. I think one of the key things that's been made very clear by the G77 and by the African group is that this is really an opportunity for transforming existing tax rules. They're asking for substantively the fair allocation of taxing rights, both based on treaties as well as profit allocation rules, which are sprouting up through existing processes such as the inclusive framework. So it's very, very interesting to see that. The other thing which I find quite interesting to see is also on the issue of transparency, and also what I would call the issue of how there's also no inclusivity and particularly reciprocity when it comes to transparency. And I really liked, for instance, what was mentioned by one of the delegates from the African group this morning. You know, we've seen that there's particularly quite a large representation of developing countries within the global forum, and that there's also quite a number of countries that have signed into MAC, but they are saying very loudly and without hiding that these transparency standards have not worked for them, that there's absolutely a new way that we must approach these issues, and that it isn't a matter of capacity building, that even when we do have the legal frameworks, we have the administrative framework, we try and measure up to the confidentiality standards, etc., etc. We still don't get access to information, because if a country refuses to do that, like what do we do then? So I really appreciated that this week member states, particularly from the African group, as well as from the G77, showed quite a lot of solidarity and coordination, and really spoke on one voice on those key issues. I think, especially considering the difficulty in attending these meetings for most of these countries, the countries that were here did a good job in representing even the ones who are not present. So we're seeing countries who may be physically or geographically tiny speak with very strong voices. So for instance, like Lesotho, on the issue of tax asymmetries, I think that was really, really, really great. Yeah, and I think also another interesting issue that played out is the issue of civil society participation. This is the first time that civil societies, organizations have been substantively allowed to take part in these processes. Most of these things take place behind closed doors. Like, you'll only find that international intergovernmental organizations are the only ones who are allowed to take part in these processes, but civil society, no, behind closed doors. So I think we're dealing with a group also that isn't too familiar with having civil society participation in the room, and so it's also room for them to learn. We are accountability stakeholders, and in my humble opinion, I think civil society played a very key role in bringing us to this point where we're actually negotiating at the early stages on a UN tax convention. So I think it's something that we also will need to build up their familiarity on. We'll need to get used to each other, so to speak. So yeah, thank you, Director.
Thank you very much. And now, after the two recaps, we come to Tove to tell us about what to expect next week.
Yes, thank you, Dereje, and thank you, colleagues. I think that's perhaps always a risky job to try and predict the future, but I'll try and do my best. So first of all, we actually have already a skeleton terms of reference, and that will be a big issue on Monday. We've seen an initial discussion about this already, but that's where it all comes together. These discussions at this stage is with the aim of delivering terms of reference and sending them back to the UN General Assembly in accordance with the mandate that we have. We've been through the first phase of the negotiations, which is about stating overall positions and discussing the big building blocks of a future UN tax convention. But now we need to see the convergence of views and see countries coming together, and we basically need to see a willingness to cooperate in good spirit. We're extremely encouraged about the atmosphere in the room for several reasons. First of all, it is extremely clear that there is a very large group of countries that are very, very keen to move forward. They see this as a very high priority issue, and they have been very clear on how important this is to them. And secondly, there has been many, many useful engagements of all countries here. Some of the discussions that we've had have actually been quite extraordinary. As Nison mentioned, we've had discussions on wealth tax and taxation of high net worth individuals. We've had some extremely honest and open conversations about the ways that corporate tax and division of taxing rights isn't working. It's already now a quite unique and historic discussion to have this in an open forum, but it's also really a chance to try and find global solutions. So the first thing we need to do is to come out of here harvesting the results of the discussions that we've had. We will see the process next week. I think try to converge on the conclusion on where we're at. We're not going to finalize any negotiating text here, is my expectation. But we need to finalize the package that we are sending to the next negotiating round starting in July this year. So that will be the test, because we've had a lot of very interesting and open conversations, but now delegates and governments need to find each other. Luckily, the task that we have this year from the UN General Assembly is not as complex as it could be. No one has actually asked us to negotiate a UN tax convention yet. We are delivering terms of reference for what a UN tax convention should address and how it should be negotiated. But there is a big difference between doing the job and outlining the plan for doing the job. We're only doing the latter. And that means that the disagreements that we have ahead of us don't need to be resolved this week. We just need to conclude what are the important issues that go into the terms of reference. It has been very clear in the discussion what the major issues are, and there are actually no surprises there, but we're happy to say that all the issues that we have been wanting to see have been covered. Lastly, I should say that we finished the session just before lunch with a very unhelpful intervention by the United States. And I think especially here at the United Nations, it's not uncommon for the United States to come in and destroy the party as everyone is starting to have a good time together. And we have also been wondering when or whether this would happen. We do bear in mind that we had 48 countries that voted no to this entire process and the resolution when it was proposed in November. Since then, we have seen a change in the atmosphere, and we do feel that many of the governments that either abstained or voted no have actually been engaging in good faith. We hope that they will keep this up. But we also know very much that the United States has some clear challenges in international tax cooperation. It's ironic to hear the United States in their intervention refer to Pillar 1 as the process that should be the focus, because Pillar 1 is actually another example of a process where the US has failed to cooperate. And this, of course, is a pattern that expands across many other areas. We know in the climate negotiations that every time there's a new president in the United States, then they either leave or join the negotiations again. So this is also one of the key proposals that we've had for the overall strategy for getting a global agreement on tax, is that instead of what the OECD has done, which we call the US first approach, everyone sees the US do something unilaterally, and then the OECD tries to turn that into a global standard, and then the United States is the first country to not sign that standard, and then everyone's left slightly puzzled about what the exercise is. Instead of the US first strategy, the common approach of the United Nations is the US last. There are so many agreements that the US has not signed and not ratified, or have been part of negotiating and then left. And what the key issue is at the United Nations is to have the critical mass to move forward. And we do feel we have critical mass in that room. We were extremely happy to see the outcome of the vote in November, because it also showed that we had 125 countries that were willing to put high priority on moving forward towards a UN Framework Convention on tax. So we're quite confident that we have critical mass. We want an agreement that includes everybody, including the United States. But if the United States jumps off the bus and then on the bus and so forth, it's far from the first time that this happens at the UN. And one important thing we have seen on other areas is that even if an agreement is negotiated without the US, it doesn't mean that the US doesn't have to follow the rules. Especially when we're talking about issues such as multinational corporations. Fact of the matter is that if a critical mass of countries say, if your corporations are going to operate in my country, they're going to have to follow my rules. If that comes from a critical mass of countries, then we can de facto see that the US and its corporations will have to follow what is a critical mass decision. So we'll see how this plays out over the coming week. We have been waiting for the fireworks, and I think the United States, they pulled out the matches in the last session. So we'll see, is this it, or is it going to come next week? But of course, this is deeply political, and we are expecting to see some real confrontations of views. But what we really plead for all governments is to start cooperating on this area, which has been so impacted by conflict, by unilateral measures, by chaos. After 100 years since UN started discussing international tax matters, it's really high time to establish real global tax cooperation. I'll hold it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.